Good afternoon, Excellencies and honorable participants. My name is Taina Bieneme, and I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. It is a great honor to moderate this panel entitled Robust National Legal Frameworks and Their Implementation, Key Factors in Addressing Human Trafficking and All Forms of Sexual Exploitation. I would like to thank OSCE ODIHR, the Gemeinsam, gegen, Menschenhandel, and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for making this groundbreaking conference possible. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I was asked to share with you a few housekeeping rules. This panel will be held in English with German interpretation. Please select the appropriate channel by using the interpretation function marked with the global icon at the bottom of your Zoom application. The format of this panel entails a short presentation by each of the speakers, followed by a short discussion and a time for a question and answer period. If you would like to ask a question to a speaker, please use the Q&A function, also at the bottom of your screen. We will compile and present them during the Q&A part of this panel. For the sake of time, I invite you to read the very short biographies of our illustrious speakers. It's my pleasure now to first introduce Professor Catherine McKinnon, a world-renowned legal scholar, activist, and author. She is the Elizabeth A. Long Professor of Law at the University of Michigan and the James Barr Ames Visiting Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. Professor McKinnon served as the first special gender advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, among many other prestigious posts. It is documented that Professor McKinnon is one of the most widely cited legal scholars in the English language. Professor McKinnon, Catherine, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Taina. And I'd like to just, guten Nachmittag to all of our German colleagues. I'd like to congratulate the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions, also the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and Gemeinsam, gegen, Menschenhandel for this really superb and promising conference, especially so. And I'm honored to be participating with you all in it. In law and in politics, as I think most of you are aware, we currently have two basic approaches to sex trafficking in its relation to prostitution. And these have had diametrically opposed results when enacted in international law. And I will be tracing these. The contrasts are particularly heightened in inequality scrutiny. One well-known approach, of course, is the sex work idea, which has produced decriminalization and legalization in various forms, for instance, in Germany, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. In this view, prostitution is considered chosen employment, needing recognition as just a job, and is regarded as sharply distinguishable from sex trafficking. The alternate analysis is the sexual exploitation approach, which considers prostitution to be neither sex in the sense of intimacy and mutuality, nor work in the sense of dignity and productivity. Based on survivor experience, expertise, and insights, and supported by social science research, prostitution in this view is recognized as a practice of inequality, specifically of systemic sexual abuse and enslavement. And it is exposed as the destination of sex trafficking, as well as creating demand for it. Prostitution, survivors teach, is properly understood as serial rape, is attempted to be abolished ultimately by those countries using the legal model flowing from this approach. It was first adopted in Sweden in 1999, and then, when embraced beyond the Nordic countries in the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, Canada, France, and Israel, in the emerging trend, is frequently termed the equality model. This legal approach removes all penalties from prostituted people, most of whom are women and girls, and trans people, most of whom are prostituting as women, and some boys and men. This model provides support for exit from the sex trade, as around 90% of prostituted people, international studies find, say they want to do. They want to get out. This approach recognizes that demand drives this industry. So it emphasizes deterring the demand by penalizing the buyer of people for sexual use. It also makes selling people for sexual use by third parties, for instance, through pimping and sex trafficking, illegal as well. Now, this approach is called the equality model because it targets an institution of sex and gender inequality, intersectionally exacerbated by race and age, founded on desperate poverty, so as to raise the status of those who are subordinated and disadvantaged by and in it, as it aims to eliminate the privilege of the powerful to buy, sell, violate, and profit from their exploitation, thus promoting social equality. When adopted in national laws, these two models are well illustrated by comparing Germany, which legalizes sex work, including by raising the legal bar for proving pimping, with Sweden, which seeks to abolish prostitution as an exploitive form of violence against women by focusing on prohibiting the purchase of sex. These two countries are leading examples, have pursued their contrasting approaches for quite a long time. They exemplify their approaches well, and good information is available on both of them. Our distinguished German and Swedish colleagues will further fill out the picture from their countries, and others will add to my flying references to New Zealand and especially, hopefully, France. Considering definitions under international law, the widely ratified Palermo Protocol to the Organized Crime Convention, again, I'm sure everyone on the panel knows this, prohibits sex trafficking as sex trafficking, what amounts to pimping a person through means including force, coercion, or the abuse of power or a position of vulnerability for purposes of sexual exploitation, which includes exploitation of the prostitution of others. When a third-party profiteer is involved in the sale of a person for sexual use by these means, sex trafficking occurs. Since over 85% of prostituted persons around the world have been found to be pimped, so far as is known through studies, the vast majority of people in the sex industry are actually being sold by others. Social forces, as well as individuals, coerce people into prostitution. Inequalities put people in positions of powerlessness and vulnerability. Focusing on inequality reveals that most people in prostitution have less power and greater vulnerability than those who sell or buy them. In addition, the majority of adult women enter prostitution as underage girls, which makes their prostitution sex trafficking by definition, until they become adults, when their vulnerability does not magically go away. Using the superior position of power that economic, ethnic, caste, sex, gender, and age privilege provide to coerce a person with less of these forms of power into sex can describe buyers as well as sellers of others for sex, as some national and transnational laws and policies recognize. In terms of consequences, the contrast between legalized countries and the Nordic or equality model countries are stark, as illustrated by Germany, which legalized the sex trade in January of 2002, and Sweden, which began implementing its model to abolish it in 2000. In Germany, after legalization, prostitution reportedly exploded 3 to 4 times in prevalence, while under the equality model, prostitution in Sweden rapidly reportedly dropped by at least 85%. Many of the occupants of German brothels are documented to be trafficked. 4 of 5 of them are not German citizens. Legalized regimes operate as a magnet for trafficking. as is particularly vividly demonstrated in parts of Australia. In contrast, intercepts from Swedish police surveilling sex buyers have overheard sex traffickers explaining that they avoid Sweden, which studies shows they overwhelmingly and sensibly do. Studies of the general population in Sweden show that the stigma of prostitution seems to be shifting to the buyers, pimps, and traffickers, while German brothels have been known to advertise dehumanizing all-day flat rate unlimited specials, which are not supposed to be allowed, actually, effectively promoting open season on prostituted women, which legitimizes, empowers, and inspires the buying of human beings and escalates demand for harmful sex. A German civil society website in December 2020 found at least 73 completed and 43 attempted murders of prostituted persons, most of them women, committed by purchasers or others in the prostitution milieu since legalization. And another found an additional 20 murders and 20 attempted murders, as well as disappearances, drug overdoses, and suicides committed by outsiders since legalization. This pattern is not confined to Germany, but has parallels in New Zealand and in the 10 legalized counties in Nevada in the United States. Meantime, not a single woman has died in prostitution since the year 2000. The German government, since at least 2007, has recognized that legalization has not produced any of the benefits its likely well-intended experiment hoped to produce. The social position of prostituted people has not improved, they found, nor have their working conditions or means of exit. Surrounding crimes, the government found, have not been reduced, nor has transparency of the sex trade increased. In contrast, the Swedish government's careful studies at the 10 and 20-year marks have found their law is working as intended. So it makes good sense that Germany is considering ending its legalized regime, for which many Germans have long organized, while Sweden is proposing to extend its model, correcting its few shortcomings. Sweden's law began as an initiative against violence against women. Its new, in the last couple weeks, proposed 40-point plan on violence against women, among its many initiatives, suggests steps, as long urged by Swedish civil society, toward rectifying its original drafting error in failing to define prostituted people as the victims of the crime of sex purchase. It is now suggesting that the benefits of making the prostituted person an injured party in judicial proceedings be investigated, and that treating women purchased for sex as crime victims per se, which would make them eligible for crime victim compensation, also be considered. Since poverty pushes people into prostitution, a fact that proponents of both approaches to it recognize without any question, this step seems as crucial as it is obvious. The new Swedish proposals also recommend eliminating what have been its ubiquitous fines as a sanction, as if buying a person is a traffic infraction, by making buying a person for sexual use, which is understood as a human rights violation, a prison-only crime. All of this is highly relevant in supporting the French equality model law, which particularly excels and is an example for the world in its supports for exit from prostitution, as against the current sex work challenge to the French law that is taking place in Strasbourg. And I will close with that and look forward to the contributions of my colleagues.
Thank you immensely, Professor McKinnon. You put it in a nutshell, prostitution is a practice of inequality in law and in practice and a destination to sex trafficking. It is a very simple concept. Our debt to you as an unparalleled scholar, activist, global thought leader is immense. So thank you so much. Our next speaker, His Excellency Jean-Claude Brunet, is France's Ambassador at Large on transnational criminal threats. Prior to this post, Ambassador Brunet has held several functions in the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, as well as the French Permanent Mission in New York to the United Nations. Thank you, Ambassador Brunet, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Greetings from Paris to all Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and honor to be participating to this event with all distinguished speakers. And I would like to thank very much the organizers, so Gemeinsam, gegen Menschenhandel, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights for organizing it and for inviting us to this discussion. I would like very much to share the French experience, and I thank Professor McKinnon for having mentioned the French equality model, the law of 2016, which I will now give you some insights on it, and on also the practice that we can measure already 5 years after its adoption. But before that, I would explain also what is our approach overall in the fight against human trafficking, which explains also the context, the political motives of this law and how it is part of a global strategy against human trafficking. And we are dealing specifically with the trafficking in human beings for sexual exploitation. We have seen for a number of years a growing global problem worldwide. And we have seen it specifically also in France. But we have this general trend sees extremely violent and well-organized organized crime networks active in this area of a very easy way to make money in terms of benefiting from the rather impunity that still exists, unfortunately, because also it's for the organized crime networks too easy to get victims among vulnerable persons, and especially the migration context has, of course, given, in particular in Europe, but also in other regions of the world, brought to these well-organized networks very vulnerable people that could be easily exploited. And it's a huge financial perspective for the organized crime, because it's a very lucrative business. And so we have seen these trends particularly, growing particularly over the last 10 years. And what is also very clearly identified is that 2/3 of the victims are women and young girls, with a growing tendency to transnational trafficking, as I have mentioned. This fact has led our authorities, and in particular our ministries for foreign affairs of France and Sweden, to launch a diplomatic initiative led by our two foreign ministers in 2019, so Margot Wallström and Jean-Yves Le Drian. It was at the 8th of March 2019 for the International Day of Women's Rights. We launched this joint strategy with a joint declaration to share experience with our partners based on our two laws in Sweden and in France, and also to promote international mobilization to help fighting the human trafficking for sexual exploitation with the particular feminist diplomacy dimension that was also developed by Professor McKinnon, because it's due to the statistics I have mentioned, particularly women and girls and children that are victims, and it's increased worry also for the violence against women and exacerbation of gender inequality. This policy on the fight against sexual exploitation and this promotion of the equality model and the law of 2016 is part of a global national action plan, where all ministries in France cooperate to fight human trafficking, where it's part, and sexual exploitation is one part of this global action plan. And of course, there are the other parts relate to forced labor and children labor and all the other aspects of human trafficking. So it's quite interesting to see that we are having this national action plan encompassing all these aspects of human trafficking. This holistic approach allows for a policy that starts with prevention, education, the identification of victims, organization of their protection, law enforcement and prosecution of criminal networks, and development of partnership with civil society, which are really key aspects of all the policy. The law of the 13 April 2016 equality model is called the law to fight the prostitutional system and for the support of and help to the victims. And it's a very important part of this holistic strategy. And it is really, it follows different objectives, and especially the legislature wanted first to strengthen the fight against pimping and the fight against human trafficking. Secondly, the better protection of the victims, and really with the development of a assistance program that is organized at the local level between all institutions to help the victims to come out of the prostitutional system. And the other third objective was to change the behavior, change the way the society sees prostitution. And because we needed also and change the legal dimension of it, of course, because for example, the penalization of prostitution was still somehow in our law and in our practice present before that law, because prostitution on the street was sanctioned. And so we had to remove the remaining parts of penalization of the victims, and at the contrary, have a change of behavior on the demand side. And that's the fourth objective, which is the responsabilization of the clients of prostitution. And so we have established through that law a fine of 1,500 euros and also sanctions through training sessions or information sessions for those who are convicted to have this information and responsabilization. So it's what we aim at is really a medium and long-term process of changing the approach, because at the heart of the policy, it's really the fact that the human body is not a commercial commodity, and with an activity that would be so contrary and going against human dignity. And we have also seen very clearly that actually 90% in France of the persons that are in prostitution are victims of organized crime networks. And that's also something that is highlighted by international reports also of the UNODC, that it's a growing number, a growing proportion worldwide. And in France, it's so 90%. So it's this was very key, the key factors that led to the political process and the parliament's adoption of the law. Now, a bit more than 4 years after the adoption of the law, what is the progress we can see? Actually, there are 4 points that I wanted to make. Is that we can see really that the law is implemented and quite well. We had already 5,000 fines and actions by the law enforcement in Paris and in the main cities throughout the country, and with already a positive effect on reducing the prostitution on the streets. And the second point is that we see the public opinion changing. It was not very easy when the law was adopted. It was quite a courageous political decision, because for the reasons I have mentioned, the previous legal regime. But we can see in 2019, the public opinion at 78% in favor of the law. The third point is that, and Professor McKinnon mentioned this, the protection of victim program and the help to come out of the prostitutional system. We can see 4 years after the adoption of the law, around 400 beneficiaries already of this system, with a coordinated approach at the département level. And these 400 victims that were choosing this program voluntarily are to 87% right now in a regular, normal job, stable job, which is so quite a successful conclusion of this program. And the fourth point is that we can see since the adoption of the law quite a strong increase of law enforcement procedures, of the penal chain actions against the organized crime networks involved in sexual exploitation, with strong condemnations, prosecution cases, for example, in Lyon, in Paris, and in other cities in the country. And we have every year about, since then, also 20 networks that are being dismantled every year. Now, we recognize, of course, that a lot needs still to be done. We have, when prostitution is out of the streets, it means that it goes online, it goes in hotel chains, and we have the pandemic has also given a boost to these internet activities, of course, and this is a challenge, and we have to fight against it. And also we have put some strong emphasis in the priority also to fight and prevent and fight against the sexual exploitation of minors and young victims. And we had recently 2 laws that were adopted by the Parliament for the prevention of prostitution of minors and teenagers, and especially also a law regarding the use of internet in this regard. And so these are, for example, 2 very important avenues for a better improved work in the future. But so I will stop there. I'm fully available, of course, for questions and answers. And again, it's really an effort on the medium and long term to responsabilize the society. It aims at really a behavioral change. We won't eradicate prostitution from one day to the other, but this sexual exploitation is a market. It's too easy for the human traffickers, and we need to make them the life more difficult, and that's why action on demand is quite a good way, in addition to the other key priorities, of course, of the fight against this aspect of organized crime. Thank you again for the invitation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Brunet, for this really extraordinary report. And with all due respect to the pioneering Sweden, whose representative we're going to hear from soon, we applaud the French abolitionist law of 2016 as the strongest equality model law in the world. And already, as Ambassador Brunet has said, has already documented extraordinary results in just 5 years. It's an example that we hope every jurisdiction must follow. And I should also point out that we are always thrilled when we hear men, especially men in authority, talk about feminist foreign policy. So thank you, Ambassador Brunet. In April of this year, the Swedish government appointed Her Excellency Anna Ekstedt as the ambassador at large for combating trafficking in persons. Among other posts, Ambassador Ekstedt served at the International Organization for Migration, or IOM, the Council of the Baltic Sea States, the European Commission in Brussels, the Swedish Gender Equality Agency, and the Swedish Migration Board, among other critically important posts. So thank you, Ambassador Ekstedt, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Distinguished participants and dear colleagues, I would like to thank, of course, ODIHR for inviting me, and also the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and Gemeinsam, gegen Menschenhandel for organizing this important and timely event. I'm happy to participate and also share some of the Swedish experiences to address trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation during the last 20 years. We've already heard a lot of information about the model from Professor McKinnon, very informed information. So we'll see, I might be repeating some of the messages here. It is unfortunately clear also from the recent reports that we hear from the UN, the EU and other actors that we're not doing enough to prevent trafficking for sexual exploitation, nor do we protect victims of this crime. And unfortunately, so also we see that far too many women are being exploited, and far too many of them are also children. And although we still lack solid and comparable data, testimonies from civil society authorities and also international actors show us that the situation for victims have worsened even more during the COVID-19 pandemic. Women and children have been put in even more vulnerable situations as a result of lockdowns and closed schools. And traffickers have also adapted and changed their modus in order to recruit and exploit vulnerable individuals from growing risk groups. Sweden currently has the OSCE chairpersonship, and we are committed to upholding the OSCE concept of comprehensive security. This encompasses political as well as economic security, including human rights, democracy, the rule of law, and gender equality. Areas which all are priorities for the Swedish chairpersonship and which closely relate to the efforts to address trafficking in human beings. To counter this problem and to prevent further exploitation and safeguard the protection and support to people in prostitution and victims, we need to take a whole of society approach and ensure that we have relevant gender-sensitive responses and legislation in place. In order to end trafficking for sexual exploitation, we definitely need to address the core root cause, namely the demand. We need to acknowledge the fact that sexual exploitation and trafficking exist due to the fact that someone, the demand side, is paying for it. The work against prostitution and trafficking of sexual exploitation is a high priority issue for the Swedish government, and it is addressed and included in the work to combat men's violence against women. And the work is also further an integral part of the Swedish feminist foreign policy. As we've heard already, the ban on the purchase of sexual services came into force in January 1999, and it's of course very central in all the Swedish efforts to reduce the demand for prostitution and human trafficking for sexual purposes. Sweden was then the first country in the world to criminalize the purchase, but not the sale of sex. And also all forms of procuring are legal. The Swedish view is that prostitution causes harm both to the individuals involved and to society at large. Not least does it affect gender equality negatively. Prostitution and trafficking human beings for sexual exploitation are, as you're aware, highly gendered issues. Men are the predominant purchasers of sexual services and users of victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation, and whether that service is being provided by women, girls, LGBTI people, men or boys. And most people in prostitution are women. By exclusively targeted demand, Sweden aims at disrupting the market while at the same time equalizing an inherent power imbalance between men and women. As we've heard also from previous speakers, the law was of course not developed in a vacuum, but evolved over decades stemming from the women's movement and with a strive to enhance gender equality in society. Several other countries have followed suit, including neighboring Norway and Iceland, as well as Ireland, Northern Ireland, Canada, Israel, and of course, France. What was first referred to as the Swedish model then became the Nordic model, and now it is more and more being referred to as the equality model, a development that we highly welcome, of course. And given our similar approach to these issues, we're currently working closely with France, as we heard from Ambassador Brunet, and we are implementing a joint diplomatic strategy to address trafficking for sexual exploitation, a cooperation that we highly value. Legislation is indeed a clear signal and often also has a normative effect. Statistics show that street prostitution has gone down significantly in Sweden, and it's also been a very important tool to counteract trafficking, as it has made Sweden a less attractive market for traffickers. It has indeed been a deterrent for traffickers, and it has also been an important tool for the law enforcement in trafficking cases. We also see that the legislation has reduced the demand for sexual services, and overall there is a strong support for the legislation amongst the general population. At the same time, of course, as we also heard from Ambassador Brunet, that availability has increased due to the internet. Prostitution and trafficking for sexual purposes are complex areas in the sense that it's constantly taking on new expressions, for example, as a result of technological developments. We see new phenomena such as sugar dating and different forms of online exploitation in Sweden, just like in any other countries. Phenomena that risk to normalize exploitation and prostitution. And the fact that ads and also transactions are taking place online, of course, poses a challenge for the law enforcement as well as social workers, as it requires a different type of outreach work to people in prostitution. It is further clear that a ban on the buying of sexual services is not enough to put an end to the sex purchases. Prostitution is a social problem to at least as greater extent as a criminal problem. A ban can only be a complement to social efforts. People in prostitution need solid exit strategies and support, as well as victims of trafficking need protection and support. Girls, women, and LGBTI people who are in prostitution are often extremely vulnerable, and we need to do more to prevent people from being recruited into prostitution and ensure that they receive the support they need and also are able to leave their situation. Legislation is indeed a clear signal, and it is evident, as I mentioned, that this law has had a normative effect. Having said this, Sweden still faces challenges in the area of trafficking human beings, like any other country, and we are We continuously have to review and develop our processes to counter this phenomena and ensure the rights of victims. And also mentioned by Professor McKinnon, the government recently presented its 40-point program against men's violence against women, where also the victim status of people in prostitution was highlighted, and also the fact that the fine most probably will be replaced by imprisonment when it comes to the buyers, according to the current proposal. Impact assessments in general are, of course, very important. A number of evaluations have been done, and currently the Swedish Gender Equality Agency, that is in charge for the national coordination against all forms of trafficking in human beings in Sweden, are currently conducting a mapping of prostitution in Sweden that will be published later this year. Also, in order to follow up on the effectiveness of the legislation and also see how it is applied by the authorities, the Crime Prevention Council in Sweden has been commissioned by the government to follow up and analyze the application of the ban on the purchase of sexual services and the exploitation of children through the purchase of sexual acts. Support to people in prostitution and victims of trafficking, as well as the cooperation between the police and social workers, will be a part of this current assessment that will be presented in 2022. Of course, prevention is also about changing norms and attitudes. In order to counteract the long-term demand for the purchase of sexual services, we see a need for universal prevention measures aimed at boys and young men, as well as efforts to change harmful norms and stereotypes that justify violence and also restrict women and girls' scope for action and life choices. We also need to work with the demand, and buyers of sexual services in Sweden who wants to stop can on a voluntary basis be offered social support and therapy. Furthermore, in 2018, a new sexual offense legislation based on consent was introduced in Sweden, meaning it is now an offense to perform a sexual act with someone who is not participating voluntarily. We see this as a very important step towards preventing abuse and also ensuring bodily integrity. And put it in relation to prostitution and trafficking, this legislation means that anyone who buys sex from someone who has been trafficked and therefore are not participating voluntarily can be convicted of rape or negligent rape. Furthermore, comprehensive sexuality education is also a significant part in reducing gender-based violence. Evidence show that comprehensive sexuality education has positive effects on young people's knowledge and attitudes related to sexual and reproductive health and behaviors. And the Swedish government has recently decided to change the school curricula of comprehensive sexuality education, and Swedish schools will now equip boys and girls with an understanding that sex must be based on consent and free will. It is clear that we all need to do much more to address this crime. Countries of destination have a responsibility to identify and protect victims, and prevention efforts need to be in place also in countries of origin. And these prevention and protection mechanisms also needs to be there when the exploitation takes place online. I also just want to underline, we hear about the legislation in France and Sweden, but no matter what our national laws look like, we all have an obligation to address the demand and the root causes of trafficking, following both the CEDAW Convention and also the UN Protocol. We cannot accept the abuse that comes with buying sex and that people are indifferent to the situation that people who sell sex find themselves in. We must do much more to prevent women from being exploited and children being sexually abused and victims of human trafficking exploited and raped. And in our work, it's very important to listen to survivors. And Sweden is happy to be able to support the establishment of ISTAC, the Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Council, which of course is a network that has can bring invaluable advice and guidance and recommendations in the formulation of anti-trafficking policies. We do need to do much more to disrupt the business model of exploitation and find efficient mechanisms and cooperation models to do so. And addressing the demand needs to be an integral part in all prevention work. And just that we still don't know, of course, how long we will have to live with the negative implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we can all learn from the effects that we've seen from the pandemic so far, and ensure that we do better and build back stronger after the pandemic as our societies open up again. And I would like to just end by thanking you all here today for your continued engagement on this important issue, and do not hesitate to contact me or any other Swedish actors for advice and support in sort of future efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ekstedt. And the world remains indebted to the government of Sweden for being such a pioneer in recognizing that prostitution is neither sex nor work, but really a complex socio-economic phenomenon that is based on inequality, sex, gender, race, etc. So thank you so much, and thank you for the extraordinary work that both the Swedish government and civil society there is doing in with respect to having society recognize that sex buying is in effect not just a criminal issue, but also a societal issue. And we have every faith that the Swedish model, now followed by 7 countries around the world, will continue having a very powerful, positive normative effect on society. Our next speaker, Ms. Sandra Norak, is a member of the OSCE-ODIHR International Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Council. Trafficked as a minor in Germany, where prostitution is legalized, Ms. Norak discusses publicly and writes about her ordeal in the brothels of Germany and her exiting processes, including in her blog entitled My Life in Prostitution. She is currently studying, if not, did you complete your law studies yet, Sandra? I don't know, but the honor is ours, and I give you the floor.
So, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you first to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Gemeinsam, gegen Menschenhandel, and OSCE-ODIHR for organizing this event together. What means coming together for this very important topic. And thank you especially to my colleagues and ISTAC survivors, Chandra and Diane, for their very powerful speeches, and all others who are with us here or in thoughts. I want to speak about robust national legal frameworks and the implementation and the key factors in addressing human trafficking and all forms of sexual exploitation. And I want today to focus on 2 points. One very important key factor to pay attention to when it comes to national legal frameworks and especially their implementation is understanding all the different forms of trafficking, the mechanisms, how they can occur, and victim identification. What also especially means understanding the individual victim-perpetrator relationship that often exists, but is often not seen. There are different forms of trafficking, but when it comes to domestic trafficking, lover boy, Romeo trafficking, where the trafficker is the partner, the family, what is very often the case, we do need to start to talk about trauma bonding, what that is, trauma bonding, and that it is important to see it so that we can help victims to break through that circle of abuse. And that was also written in a new report by OSCE called Applying Gender-Sensitive Approaches in Combating Trafficking in Human Beings. And they wrote, for example, that in human trafficking cases, the relationship between the victim and the trafficker may be complex. It may involve trauma bonding, familial ties, and romantic relationships, and also violence, fear, and manipulation. And that being aware of these relationships and the nature of trauma bonding can facilitate both the identification of victims as well as the prosecution of the traffickers. So my dear fellow ISTAC colleague and survivor from Canada, Timea Nagy, showed us ISTAC members a very good awareness website built by the police in Toronto in Canada, where they, for example, are answering questions survivors may have on a website. And one of those questions is, what is trauma bonding? And the police answers on the website, and And in their answers and in the whole website, they implemented 90% of what survivors were telling them, because they recognized that to answer these questions in a way where it can help other victims most effectively to understand what happens to them, the help of those who live through it is very important to work better on solutions that can reach those who are still in the same situation. So I want to quote a little bit what they are writing on the site. There is this question, what is a trauma bond? And trauma bonding is a psychological response to abuse. It occurs when the abused person forms an unhealthy bond, a traumatic bond with the person who abuses them. And there are also signs of trauma bonding listed there by police. The trafficked person may show gratitude for small kindnesses shown by the trafficker, feel loyal or defend the trafficker, rationalize violence by the trafficker, have protective feelings toward the trafficker, feel that only the trafficker can help or care for them. And the police is also answering the question with the help of survivors. Why do I feel that I can't leave? And I was, when I was trafficked, I had also this question in my mind, why do I feel that I can't leave? And they are writing that understanding the way this bond works can help explain why people stay in violent or abusive relationships. And the common but harmful question, why don't you just leave, doesn't account for the complexity of a trauma bond and the mental reprogramming it requires to break one. So they are listing a number of reasons researchers have identified as to why it is so difficult to break a trauma bond. So trafficking victims may feel that it is normal what happens to them because a lot of them don't know something else because they have experienced, for example, abuse in childhood and it's normal for them. Or the pimp is the partner. They are brainwashed by the trafficker. They are afraid to leave. And they may feel like their situation being trafficked for sex is better than if they were to be free. There might not be enough family or community support to make it on their own. And 2 points who are very sad, they are also mentioned on this website that is that many survivors, due to low self-esteem from childhood abuse or by being exploited in a sex trade, believe that they deserve to be abused. So these victims of trauma feel that they are unworthy of safety, of love, of healthy human connection. And many survivors feel so changed by their experience of being trafficked that they do not believe that they will ever be able to fit into the real world ever again. So due to this belief, they feel there is no point in trying to escape from their trafficker. So this website I was talking about is called htsurvivors.to. And I would sign every word they are writing there. And it's a very good site and example to help victims and survivors also in understanding what's happening, as well as others to understand what's going on. So why do I talk about this trauma bond? I talk about this because a lot of the trafficking I have seen in Germany was trafficking by the own family and by partners, where trauma bonding plays a big role and was all present every day and was actually the main reason why the victims were not able to escape the exploitation. These women want to escape the circle of abuse. They want to leave and escape the trafficker, but they can't. They are locked in often invisible chains. That they can't leave does not mean they want to stay. It means that they are too weak to leave and need help. And to really need help and to really help, it needs understanding. And that also means to be aware of these invisible chains. So when I look back at my trafficking situation, I was trafficked through so-called lover boy method. It would have helped me a lot if there were people, authorities, laws, police, judges, state attorneys, understanding all the mechanisms of trafficking, and there are much more, of course, and the trauma bonding with skills in their hand, helping me breaking through that circle and holding my trafficker accountable. In Germany, I actually have not heard the word trauma bonding from authorities when it comes to trafficking, but it's important to speak about it because so many trafficking victims are affected by that. And we have to hold our eyes open for it when making laws, when we are implementing those, and when we are coming in contact with victims to identify and to help them. The second point I want to speak is about demand and legislation. One other key factor in addressing human trafficking is, and it was mentioned today several times, next to effective laws against trafficking and exploitation, we really do have to focus on demand on the buyer side. So legislative measures to target that the impunity ends. And we do have different legislative approaches to tackle demand for trafficking and exploitation. And I do recommend the new paper from OSCE on demand, which is very good. And we have actually three approaches to tackle demand. In the first approach we do have in Germany, it's criminalizing the knowing use of trafficking victims, but that is not very effective because this can hardly be proven. The second approach is criminalizing the use of all trafficking victims in the form of strict liability. So the second approach, the general criminalizing of the use of all trafficking victims, no matter if the buyer knows or not knows that the person is trafficked, is a better approach, in my opinion, because it makes it easier to prosecute a buyer, because it must only be proven that he used the victim, but not that he knew that the victim was trafficked. But the problem with this approach is that you first have to prove that the person who was used as a trafficking victim, and this is, as I can see in Germany, in most of the cases, very hard with our laws. So it means that users are almost always safe and not convicted. So the third approach is criminalizing all demand, the so-called Swedish Nordic model, which I prefer and which I'm fighting for in Germany. Catherine McKinnon spoke about that. The two other approaches do not work effectively, and I'm convinced that to fight trafficking and exploitation, we need to reduce demand for prostitution in general, because, as I always say, demand is a breeding ground for trafficking. Where there is a high demand for prostitution, it's much more lucrative for traffickers because of the big market of users there. We have an estimated number of about 1.2 million users who use sexual services every day. This is because of our liberal laws and liberal handling of prostitution. And this demand has to be met, and it will be met by traffickers, what means producing and generating a lot of victims. Germany has ratified, for example, Palermo Protocol that says in Article 9, Section 5, that state parties shall adopt or strengthen legislative or other measures to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation of persons, especially women and children, that leads to trafficking. And here, not only the demand for trafficking is meant by Article 9, Section 5 that should be discouraged, it's the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation of persons that is meant. And there is not only legislation and criminal law where we should focus on when it comes to discouraging demand, but other measures such as enlightenment, prevention campaigns, etc. In Germany, we actually do not focus on demand in any way. Instead, what we do is promoting prostitution in form of advertising, calling it a normal service. And such a handling is totally counterproductive to discourage demand that fosters trafficking. This will definitely not discourage demand in this often criminogenic area of prostitution, where you can find so much sexual exploitation. You know, I was telling the estimated number of buyers or users we do have every day. It's 1.2 million. And on this estimated number, you can see that Germany is totally failing when it comes to tackling the demand. This must stop. And we do have to implement measures that are discouraging this high demand, because this high demand fosters trafficking for sexual exploitation. We also have to look on the prostitution system in general, because we know from several studies and stories that a lot of those who were there by free choice have experienced sexual abuse in childhood, exploitation, violence, and are not there because they want to be penetrated every day, but because of their worst experiences they have made before, because of being traumatized, because of seeing no other opportunity. And this is not a system that should be supported and normalized as basically a service by government and society, as it is here in Germany. because the essence of the system is a violation of human dignity, as the European Parliament has stated in its resolution in 2014, on equality between women and men. So at the end, spontaneously, I want to give another survivor a voice. A survivor friend of mine who was trafficked from Brazil to Germany as a minor and now living in Italy. Her name is Lilian Altuntas, is listening here now and wanted to say something what was not possible 2 hours ago in the Zoom format. So I will tell you now what she sent me to tell you here. She said while crying, "Here are so many important people. You have to know, no one of us dreamed to be a prostitute. If you saw smiling in our faces, then that was just because we were forced to smile. But when you look deeper in our eyes, you're seeing a scream for help. Every day I tell myself, I'm not a whore. I'm not the things my abusers called and treated me. I am Lilian Altuntas, a mother, a cake baker, and I'm free now. But free is my body, and it feels that my soul is still trapped because of this life I was forced into. I do thank you for this event today, and that you hear our voices and that you're working to protect us. Do not stop, please do not stop, because I believe there is no win without a fight, and I'm sure we will win this fight. Thank you, Lilian, very much for raising your voice. We will fight all together. Soon there will also be a film about Lilian's story in German TV, because she's also breaking with silence and has a story full of brutality and abuse happening here in Germany. So thank you at the end, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Gemeinsam gegen Menschenhandel, and OSZE-Büro, to all the people fighting with us. And also a very big thank you to the governments and civil societies of Sweden, France, and others who are leading with their legislation approach the way into the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you immensely, Sandra. We truly appreciate your courage. We say every single day we could not do our work without the bravery and the courage and the vision and the lived experiences of prostitution survivors. So thank you. Thank Lilian, thank you to Chandra and Diane, who also participated here. Your points are extremely salient, particularly on the psychological effects of prostitution. We have, as we'll hear from our next speaker, we have very little data on the physical and medical consequences of prostitution on individuals, but some studies have shown that when living compounded sexual traumatic experiences, the first thing that disappears is imagination. And therefore, so many of the people who are trapped in prostitution cannot imagine their lives outside of prostitution. So we truly salute you and honor you for your courage, and also for bringing up the critical point about what you described as intergenerational prostitution, the fact that so many people are first bought and sold because of their families or intergenerational situations or by their partners. So our final speaker will also address some of these issues. I am very pleased to introduce Assistant Professor Wanjiku Kaime Aterhog, who is a senior lecturer and researcher at Mid-Sweden University at the Department of Psychology and Social Work. For over 20 years, she has conducted research, including for the benefit of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. She will now present the results of her study commissioned by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung on the impact of the Swedish prostitution law. Thank you, Ms. Kaime Aderhog. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Taina. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The challenge of being the last speaker is that everyone has spoken what I intended to share, but allow me to share perspectives from the field to complement what has already been presented. And now I will share my screen. Let's see. So I'll be presenting perspectives on the Swedish model. I'll bring you field perspectives on what different stakeholders have shared. And these are victims, survivors of trafficking, persons in prostitution, and persons who are buying sex, as well as policymakers, law enforcement officials, and civil society organizations, and therapists. And these perspectives or these studies were carried out in different phases. The first one was carried out in 2018, and then the second one is ongoing on redefining care, and actually builds on the findings of the first study, and especially the finding on the need for services for those exiting prostitution. And then in conjunction with this conference, I have also collected additional data now in June from 5 care providers. So these are perspectives from the field that will complement what has already been mentioned. I'd like to mention also that in conducting research, I usually initiate data collection with what I call a search phase. And that's a search. I've coined a new word in research, and it's search. And there, what I aim to do is connect with the individuals in the field. It's negotiate entry into their community, into that space, in order, and then together create a safe space within which data can then be collected. And in that way, then we explore challenges together. And this process is usually driven by trust, co-creation, and action. And it's bringing those who are experiencing the phenomena, in this case prostitution, to actually be co-creators of the knowledge, so co-researchers in the process. And that is important in bringing the voice of those who are experiencing the phenomena, but also it's being able to create a space where they can be vulnerable, where we can actually peel off the layers of what are the perceived challenges and get to the core of the problem. And that is what I have, the methodology or approach that I use in my research. Now, let's focus on what I term as, I call the building blocks of the Swedish model. And here I would like to emphasize or focus on what the respondents that I interviewed mentioned as a core period before the enactment of the law in Sweden. And they mentioned this period of intense or thorough research that was conducted in order to understand the problem, the phenomena from the core, as well as the advocacy efforts by women's organizations mainly. And then the political debate, political and public debate that ensued based on that knowledge, then ending up in framing the problem as a social problem. And it is this approach that I have mentioned also of coming into the context where the persons are exploited, that was also adopted by the researchers who conducted the research in the 70s, and coming into those spaces where women were exploited in prostitution, and indeed identifying the real conditions and the situations. And with that knowledge, then it was used to then come up with the solutions. Another interesting perspective that is important to note, also mentioned by those interviewed, was this understanding of the harms of prostitution, the close link between prostitution and sexual exploitation, and thereby trafficking. And with this understanding and the broad knowledge, then the problem was actually framed It was this foundation that is important to understand. Normally, when you hear about the Swedish model abroad, it's usually the legal component, especially, that is put forward. But the work that went into defining, framing the problem, not only in the political sphere, but also in public debate, bringing people into the discussion, that was critical in actually framing the problem, and then the solutions that then were put forward. And this is exactly what I take up in a framework that I have developed to understand vulnerability. It's this broad understanding of the contributing factors that start from an individual level and then can be also interlinked with levels at the family level, in the family, as well as general structural societal issues. And it's the interplay of those factors together. It's not one factor, but it's a combination of these factors that then push people into these exploitative situations. And this is the understanding that we had also in Sweden before the law was enacted. Looking at prostitution as exploitative and, in fact, harmful not only to the individuals involved, but to society in general. And then if you look at the intervening factors, you see the role of laws and policies that they play in framing the solutions and indeed setting the tone to the kind of services that are then developed at the national level. And this is exactly what happened when the Sex Purchase Act was enacted as well, giving a framework for the work to be undertaken, and also setting a tone that indeed prostitution is not, the purchasing of sexual services is not something that is condoned in society. So laws serve a very important function in enabling, providing that enabling environment in society, but also guiding these services. And again, I'd like to draw your attention to the triggers there. As you see, it's both prostitution and trafficking listed under triggers. And the only difference really is when between the two would be when force would be used to abduct a person. Otherwise, we see this very thin line, or it's difficult to separate the two really. And here within this framework, we can say actually that prostitution then is a vehicle for trafficking or for sexual exploitation when, for example, a person receives a non-existent, for example, job offer, and on the basis of that then embarks on that journey. And then when they arrive in the country of destination, it turns out to be prostitution. So then it becomes a vehicle into sexual exploitation, and that's important also to note. And what was also noted when enacting the Swedish model, it's that link. I'd also like to mention here the close link between or the diffused line between sexual exploitation, or what is considered as non-consensual sexual interactions, and consensual sexual interactions. Normally we see these as two differing aspects, but here I'd like to suggest that indeed it is they are defined. It's the same thing. They're very it's a very thin line between the two, and that it's a fluid process that changes over time. So, for example, a person may have consented to a sexual interaction, a paid sexual interaction, but then as the conditions change, then it can actually be seen as exploitation. And it's that context of vulnerability that is important to note. And it can also be explained by exploitation theory, where we see that this context of vulnerability can also be determined by, for example, when an interaction is harmful, so that a person ends up being worse off than when they entered, then that is considered to be exploitation. Or when an interaction is mutually beneficial but occurs in an unfair context. And this unfair context is, for example, that the person, for example, is in an unequal position of power, or because of societal structural issues, as I mentioned before, the structural factors that are contributing to exploitation, then that is can be seen as a mutually beneficial interaction. But because it occurs in an unfair context, then it is considered as exploitation. And this is exactly what the results of the study that was carried out in 2018 pointed towards, where the contributing factors were actually mentioned by the respondents as being the push factors combined with the triggers that then pushed people into these exploitative situations in prostitution. And the dream was mentioned, the dream for a better future, for a better life was mentioned as a pulling factor. So in fact, persons that were interviewed who were engaged in prostitution or who had exited prostitution mentioned that the push factors worked to push, the push and the pull factors actually worked in combination to get them into prostitution. And it is the dream that was a pulling factor. But indeed, when they entered into prostitution, as we heard here from Sandra, many of them mentioned it was like a black hole, and it was impossible for them to leave without support. And what happened also was that then the dream disappeared. And when they exited prostitution, then what happened was that they mentioned they ended up worse off than when they entered. So it's not only the factors, the contributing factors or the push factors that were eminent, but also the additional emotional, psychological, and physical harm. And this is very important to bear in mind when we're talking about the harms of prostitution. As we heard, it is getting people not only to exit, but also to heal and to be restored. And in the study in 2018, we attempted to define sexual exploitation. We had an operational definition. We did not include outcomes where sexual exploitation was seen as involvement in sexual services, where the party in which the party that provides them is taken advantage of, for example, taken advantage of in a position of vulnerability and is treated or receives outcomes that are harmful, unfair and harmful. In the operational definition, we hadn't included outcomes, but after the research, we realized the central position or the central role that the harms of prostitution plays for persons in prostitution, but those exiting, and we added that in the definition. And this is exactly what the studies that were carried out in Sweden actually showed on the harms of prostitution for the individuals, but also for society in general. And based on that knowledge, then developed the package for addressing prostitution. And these are the three components of the Swedish model, the first one being the restrictive one, and that's the one we usually hear about, and that focuses on the criminalization of purchase and facilitation of sexual services to reduce demand, and this is a legal component. And then we have the supportive and restorative one, which focuses on when it comes to persons engaging, persons in prostitution, it focuses on decriminalization of the selling of sexual services. And there, it's not only the decriminalization, but it's supported or combined with the provision of care alternatives to actually exit. And in some instances, in some municipalities in Sweden, there is also a harm reduction component when caregivers reach out on the streets, for example, providing condoms. And this component also includes the provision of sexual of services to buyers that wish to change their behavior. And this is provided to in different municipalities, not nationally, but in 3 different municipalities. Then we have the third component, which comprises the transformative component, and it's education to the public, but also the private sectors in order to change attitudes and norms to prostitution, masculinity, and sexuality. And it's these 3 components, when they are implemented in combination, that lead to the desired effect of reducing prostitution and trafficking for sexual exploitation. And we have seen in Sweden, based on the studies as has been mentioned before, the change in norms and attitudes towards prostitution. And we also see the government coming up with strategies, as Ambassador Anna Ekstedt has mentioned, to address gaps or hiccups in the system that are identified as these phenomena do change, as society changes. And so it's important to have that active engagement also in addressing these issues. One of the things that has been mentioned as important is the provision of care to those who are in prostitution. And those interviewed mentioned the 3 rooms in which care is provided. And the first one was outreach, and it's creating a safe space within this room of exploitation and reaching out to persons in prostitution with the aim of establishing contact and relationships. And based on those relationships, then they move them, they are invited to different services that are, or short-term services that are offered in the second room, not in that context of exploitation, but outside, removed from that context. And this takes place after an established relationship. And once trust is established and some form of stability, then there is engagement to support them through long-term services, including, for example, trauma therapy, social and health services. In the second room, it's more transient care, more emergency, but outside of these rooms of room of exploitation, which is often where they make contact with them in the first room, on internet or on the streets. And this was mentioned to be extremely important. It's a long and involved process, but as we heard from other speakers, the survivors before, that yes, it is hard. It is hard work. It is difficult, but we do also see successes. So it is possible for people to actually exit prostitution, exit these places of exploitation, and lead a restored life. Now, in Sweden, what has happened with the enactment of the Sex Parties Act and with the implementation of the model, we have seen a shifting, and that has also been mentioned by other speakers, where there is a shift when it comes to liability, when it comes to the shame and guilt. It's a shift from those who are in prostitution to those who actually are purchasing the sexual services, and that has been evident. And what we need to strengthen and work on, be better at, is actually shifting the burden of prostitution through implementation of these services for those exiting prostitution. And that will require long-term and sustainable funding and very focused work in these different rooms of care. And the difference with the situation that we have now in Sweden from when the act was enacted is that it is not mainly Swedish nationals who are exploited in prostitution, but it is not Swedish nationals. And therefore it is important to have a restorative component that actually supports the persons exiting prostitution beyond Sweden, beyond into when they are repatriated back into their countries of origin, that it's important to have that in mind when developing care for the individuals that exit prostitution. And the other components that I'd like to mention for our context in Sweden is organizing the care in the first and second rooms, particularly at a local level, ensuring that those services are available in every municipality. And for these services in the first two rooms, what was mentioned by the respondents was proximity of the care, that outreach can be made in a local context. So that was important. When it comes to restorative services, those can be offered at a regional level, and it is important to work across sectors, health and social sectors, for example, in providing that care. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present these perspectives from the field.
Thank you, Wanjiku. This was really extraordinary and a model, I believe, that can be used in every country. And thank you for highlighting or offering us some solutions to these very complex issues on how to provide support and care at so many levels to both prostituted victims and survivors. So we are opening our this panel now to questions. We do have a few questions from the public. Thank you again to each of the panelists. I certainly learned a great deal. If I may, I have one question before I give it to the public, and that is in particular for you, Wanjiku, but I would like each of you to comment on the fact that, to my knowledge, there is not one report either by any United Nations agency or National Institutes of Health or Centers for Disease Control that really focuses on the harms of prostitution. We all know, those of us who are women's rights advocates, understands that breaking the silence is the first point in addressing human rights violations against women and girls, and that has been done, but we also need documentation, data, similar to what has been done at the level, for instance, of female genital mutilation, where it was only deemed a human rights violation when we understood the extreme lifelong and harmful consequences of FGM on women and girls. And the same should be done for prostitution. Do you know of any such studies? And if not, either nationally or internationally? And if not, what will it take for us to get there? And Wanjiku, why don't you start, and then followed by Ambassador Brunet, Anna, Catherine, and then Sandra. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. I believe what is important is acknowledging, I believe the entry point or the understanding of prostitution determines the actions. For example, Sweden framing the problem as a social problem determined the actions. And I believe what hinders, especially the United Nations bodies, from conducting research is the framing or the understanding of what prostitution is. Because if it's understood as a job, then I believe the interventions that will be carried out will be to ensure safety for those involved in prostitution. So I think it's the framing that we need to address to start with. But also, I believe that a place to start is actually at the national level. For example, Sweden, in one of these, the 40 point, the decision points that have come forward, one of them is actually directed towards national research at the national level, and the research institutes have been given the task to actually put out calls for research on violence at a national level. So I believe starting at the national level will, and having governments to fund such research will add to this body of knowledge that we need. But it's also important to use methodologies, as I mentioned, that at the community level, which allow us to come into closer contact and to build relationships with the individuals in question, to develop, to be able to collect that kind of data. So a combination of both national level research as well as those local community-based initiatives is needed.
Thank you. Ambassador Brunet, would you have?
Yeah, thank you. It's a difficult question, and we must be very humble because indeed, I think the question you touched upon quite a big challenge for all countries, but we have seen in France also how important that data collection is, and the help of civil society working associations working together with official agencies is very key to understand better the reality of the victims of sexual exploitation, and it's always we need to be improving the collection of information. What I would like to say is that the whole policy in France regarding the fight against human trafficking, with the National Action Plan in 2013, and now we have the second National Action Plan, all was really based on these data collection, but where we had inquiries, reviews with civil society and public officials, and trying to, and each, it's not easy to identify the victims, but it was a huge job. It was only partial, of course. It's the start, and we definitely need to be better. But I think this is a constant effort to know better the realities, and that's an example where we need the civil society interacting and the partnership with the governments, and then also states sharing this data internationally with UN bodies or OSCE or others, indeed, and it's a constant effort. Yeah.
Thank you. Catherine, would you?
To my knowledge, you're right that the collection of information and data on the harms of prostitution has been overwhelmingly led by civil society, in particular by survivors in their interaction with research entities. And it's also true, as noted, sometimes, and then government, as Ambassador Brunet has noted, has made productive use of this. For example, in France, Fondation Celle has done excellent research, and as have others. But I think that in addition to the misframing noted by our Swedish colleague, of the issue as a job, it also sometimes by governments, sometimes by international organizations and treaty bodies and so on, have misframed prostitution as an individual question rather than a systemic or even structural one. And this has contributed, I think, to the atomization of the vision of what needs to be looked at, and hence at the level on which organizations need to take responsibility for both investigating it and addressing it.
Thank you. Anna, did you have any thoughts?
I don't have much to add from previous speakers, but only just also to underline the fact that I also agree that it's the framing that could be a bit problematic, but it shouldn't be problematic in the sense that the protocol talks about the exploitation of the prostitution of others. It wouldn't be too controversial to look at the prostitution scene as such. And also, I think we could do much more from data from health providers and also social support services rather than looking at sort of law enforcement data and criminal justice data in order to get a fuller picture.
And Sandra, did you have any thoughts on this issue?
So I totally agree that we do not have a lot of data, but we actually should have a lot of data because this is a very important issue also, especially the long-term effects of trafficking and prostitution. What we do have in Germany, for example, are two studies, one from the Federal Family Ministry from 2004, but it's not really about the long-term effects. It's about violence and prostitution, and but not really about the long-term effects. And we do also have a study from Sumbeck from 2001, but it's also not about long-term effects. There you can read, for example, that 81% of the respondents were exposed to sexual assault, or that 61% of the women had experienced rape related to prostitution, and 70% had been physically assaulted. But we do not have, studies about this long-term effects. And, it's always when you listen to survivors, you get it firsthand, the long-term effects. But I totally agree that we need data for science.
Yes, thank you. So one of the questions from the audience actually goes to Ambassador Brunet, but I believe each of you can talk about this. And thanking everyone for their contributions. The question is about whether France has found that stigmatization towards prostituted people has reduced since the law. And I dare to quote former Minister Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, who said, "Prostitution itself is stigmatizing." So what are your thoughts, Ambassador Brunet, and the others as well? Thank you.
I think the poll I have mentioned in 2019 with this huge figure of support, over 70%, almost 80% for the 2016 law, is already quite an answer to your question. Because I think what the public has understood is really the paradigm change of the reality that we are facing. When we are talking today of prostitution, we are talking about a organized crime activity and victims that are being trapped by these organized crime networks and vulnerable people, and so much more than in the past. The French people understand, and that today this is a big change compared to what prostitution may have been in the past. Although if you read the short stories and text of Maupassant about what prostitutes' life is, you could see that this is a preoccupation in the French public that relates quite for some time. And also the law in France who closed the prostitution houses was just after the Second World War, also already there a quite strong push for recognizing what suffering this situation can be, and that was so that's something that was very present. But I think this is now really a clear change in the feeling that there is no, and that's why there is a support for the law as with this behavioral change policy and objectives, because there is a recognition that prostitution means, again, in France, it's 90% of the cases. It does not mean an independent work.
And the second part to that question is, has the stigmatization shifted to sex buyers, which is also the question for Sweden?
And therefore, it's support to the law means that the fact that if you are having a fine or you are sentenced because you drive badly, and you have to be with other bad drivers to have a behavioral change and learn how to do it. The same way the law foresees this also for sex buyers, and the fact that public opinion is thinking that this is normal, I think is a shift towards less stigmatization, and the fact that it's a recognition that in France today, it was no longer possible to have a legal provision that was allowing police to fine or to held person in prostitution in jail for the night just because there was prostitution on the street. And so this was no longer acceptable because the public opinion didn't want at all to see a person in prostitution as not behaving well for the community, but at the contrary, sees them now clearly as victims.
Thank you. Anna, has the stigma shifted to sex buyers in Sweden?
I would say already from the onset of when the legislation first came into place, it was already then the stigma was put on the buyers, given the fact also that Vanjiko mentioned it was a long discussion in society already before the law came. So it has sort of always been a stigma to be a buyer for a long time in the Swedish society. But I think we need to continuously work on it because I think the stigma goes both ways, unfortunately, and it takes a long time to change norms and prejudice and perceptions in society. So this is something that we continuously need to discuss also with young people, etc., in order for this not to shift. And also what I mentioned this with, for example, sugar dating, etc., so we don't shift the norm to making it sort of more okay to be on the buyer's side.
Thank you. With 2 minutes left, if I could ask Catherine, Sandra, and Wanjiku for 30-second final statements, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. I would just underline what the Swedish and French colleagues have just said, and that is in a sense, the passage of the equality model is a shift in stigma from prostituted people to those who buy them and sell them. It recognizes that prostitution is done to the people in it, not by them. And that is a stigma shift. It is the paradigm change that Ambassador Brunet has mentioned. I'd also noticed that the Swedish studies I'm aware of show that the younger people are, the more they find the buying of another person for sexual use to be simply incomprehensible. In other words, who does that? I mean, who would do such a thing? Seems to be the attitude that emerges from those general studies. So that suggests that the stigma is, the longer one operates under an equality model, the more the stigma shifts away from the people who are being violated and exploited in prostitution and to the people who are violating and exploiting them.
Sandra, or why don't you, yes, you just unmuted.
So I can say, it's not the law that is stigmatizing. It's not the law that is stigmatizing the women. It's what happened in prostitution, and that will not change. Also not with a law we do have in Germany with liberal legislation, and also not with decriminalization in New Zealand. When we have liberal laws on prostitution, the stigmatizing is much more, because people think you want what happens there and the majority does not want it. But there is also less empathy for trafficking victims, because I often heard, for example, from sex buyers or from others in society that say, oh, we all don't want to work sometimes, when it's coming to forced prostitution and trafficking, because of seeing it as a job, there is no awareness about what it means to be trafficked and to be forced prostituted. So the stigma is much more on the prostituted women in Germany. And when we focus on the sex buyers and put the stigma on them, this will also help victims to not be stigmatized as they are now in Germany.
Outside that, in Sweden, we have seen this shift in stigmatization due to the legislation. And in order to shift also the burden of prostitution, focusing on the harms of prostitution, we need to have targeted care to those exiting prostitution, enabling them to move on from these exploitative situations. And since the majority of those that are exploited in Europe are from countries outside Europe. For example, in Sweden, it's mostly from Africa or from Eastern European countries. Then actions need to be actually taken together with those countries of source in order to develop mechanisms to support them, not only starting from here, from countries of destination, but also to countries of source. So it needs coordinated effort. Thank you.
Let me unmute myself. So thank you again to each of our very inspired and distinguished panelists. Thank you, OSCE, especially Tatiana and her amazing team, to the Gemeinsam, gegen Menschenhandel and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for this extraordinary conference. Thank you, audience, for joining us. You have offered us all unparalleled fuel to continue our work to end sex trafficking and the exploitation of prostitution in all of our countries and around the world. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. Stay healthy. and safe.
Thank you so much, Dana, for this incredible panel. Just a short announcement. Tomorrow, the conference continues with another 2 very exciting panels, which are going to be very practical in approach. We very much look forward to seeing you there. And I would also like to thank everyone who's been working in the background today from the various co-organizers teams, as well as the interpreters. And we very much look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 14:00 CET. Thank you very much and have a good rest of your evening.
Recording stopped.